That doesn't last. These things never do last. So by 1973, the world is back into economic depression, effectively. It's really interesting that people, during the Brexit debacle in this country over the last 4 years, I guess, I'm just saying, things, we survived fine without the European Union. It's like, no, we didn't. Actually, in the early 70s, Britain was a basket case of a country. You had mass strikes. You had mass inflation. You had the 3-day week, a remarkable time where literally people would only go to work for 3 days, not because we had more leisure time or anything like that, but that's basically how long you could keep the electric on in the country for people to go to work. So an extraordinary time, not really so much marked by civil disobedience and the threat of civil action, but after the optimism of the post-World War II era, a huge crash. So the gold standard ends in 1971. The Yom Kippur War and the OPEC oil embargo of 1973 drives cost of fuel up and the cost of petrol up, which means there's a global depression and fuel crisis, huge inflation, mass job losses, which are fought back by unions, so there's huge strikes, and a huge fracture appears in British society between, if you like, the sort of social democratic left, which had been in dominant mode, and even to an extent the conservative governments of the post-Second World War era, to an extent acknowledged the sort of social democratic foundations of society that had emerged during that time, and a new kind of right-wing conservatism which emerges as a response to this economic crisis. That, in the British context, is known as Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher, 3 times Prime Minister, 1979, 1983 and 1987. 79 and 83 by absolute landslides. A bit closer in 1987. She'd eventually leave office in 1990. So she was Prime Minister for just under 11 years. Basically, Thatcher's political ideology can be summed up in 2 policies: economic liberalism and political conservatism. Basically, free economy and strong state. So Thatcherism emerges as a response to the crises of the 1970s, but the emergence of Thatcherism taps into a very particular kind of newspaper coverage, and it's sort of the marriage of tabloid newspapers, especially The Sun, and Thatcherism becomes a marriage made in heaven for the perpetuation of the Thatcherite political and economic dogma which would dominate Britain in the 1980s. So what do I mean by economic liberalism? So Thatcher's economic policies were influenced by the Austrian schools, so von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, known as the New Right, or what we call neoliberal economics. I'm sure many of you have heard that term neoliberal before. An ideological belief in the free market, against state intervention and against distortion of free markets by the state. So ideologically, the economic liberals believe that companies should be allowed to get on with things and not being burdened by the state in any way, shape or form. The only way for things to run efficiently and best as they can is if you leave business alone. Let them get on with things. Don't burden them with regulation. Don't burden them with undue taxation, etc., etc. Businesses will, and the free market itself is self-correcting, and things will be fine if you leave things alone. So on the flip side of that, consider, like, okay, so what does the state do economically? Economic liberals are massively against the welfare state, the NHS, BBC, trade unions, any kind of workplace legislation. No, don't want any of this. Can't have the NHS because this could be a free market in healthcare. We should get rid of the NHS. Can't have the BBC. How can you have a state-owned, how can you have a state-sponsored broadcaster? No, this is ridiculous. BBC is a dinosaur. We must have commercial news, and we must have commercial television. You must have all this kind of radical difference to what emerged in the 50s and 60s in terms of the political consensus. very much pro-privatization and private ownership. So during the 1980s, you see the mass privatization of state-owned businesses in the UK. British Telecom, for example, was a state-owned business. Now it's a private business. British Steel, the railways, that happened in the 90s, but it's the same economic dogma. British Airways was a state-owned business and now is a private business. The final sort of tenet of economic liberalism is trickle-down economics. So basically, the market is very, very efficient, and if you allow people who are successful in the market to become as rich as possible, that wealth will trickle down society. You know, the wealthy people will buy things, so this layer of people get stuff, and then these people will buy things, and basically money will flow through society. This, my friends, is absolute, complete and utter nonsense. This trickle-down economics, unbelievably, is still spouted by some followers of neoliberal economics today. There is no evidence since the 1970s that trickle-down economics has ever worked, but it is still something that we hear. If you follow these sort of discussions in the press, and if you follow these discussions in economics, still something that people give. Even to the extent to which Donald Trump has, although he's not, I don't think he's ever used the term trickle-down economics, because I'm not sure he would understand what it means, because he's a bit of an idiot, right? But his economic policies in the United States are a form of neoliberal trickle-down economics, basically. So it's still being used, but it's a pillar which has just basically been blown away over time. The political conservatism that goes hand in hand with economic liberalism is very, very interesting. A conservative belief in the need for social order, so required a strong interventionist state. And what we mean by that is the police and army. And you may think, well, Britain's not a police state, Britain's not like a military dictatorship. Well, at times in the 1980s, you would struggle to defend that view. Very much goes hand in hand this with a belief in personal morality and an anti-liberal approach towards personal morality itself as well. So, Thatcherism and the right-wing press at a time of mass austerity in the early 80s, 3 million unemployed in Britain, etc. These two go hand in hand with one another. The press starts to reflect a lot of the both spoken and unspoken assumptions of economic liberalism and political conservatism. The press is highly anti-union, highly anti-Labour Party, anti-scroungers and immigrants, pro-business, worries about, are we great anymore? Is great, when will Britain be great again, and all this nonsense. Again, if you've got any interest in newspapers, you recognise that these discourses are going on and have been for the last 4 years. Very populist politics and right-wing morality. So the right-wing press mimics the political position of the Thatcher government. You see the emergence of new owners such as Murdoch, Maxwell, Conrad Black. Primary motive financial, and newspapers are actually at this point part of conglomerates rather than locally used. So someone like Rupert Murdoch, for example, yes, he's a newspaper owner. He's also a television station owner. He's also a film studio owner, etc., etc., etc. Newspapers become part of a broader, wider business. Basically, these people are global barons. They have global influence, but they still like to align with political leaders. And indeed, Thatcher does a huge amount in the 1980s to promote this kind of business ethic of being a global press baron, pushing through takeovers, supporting the business model of accumulating as much of the press and as much of other subsidiary media businesses as possible during this time. So this creates a new close relationship between the government and newspapers. Prime ministers actually go out of their way to be on side with these press barons, the new generation of press barons. I mean, probably the most significant thing Tony Blair did in the 1990s, before he was elected in 1997, was to meet Rupert Murdoch. And it caused a huge amount of controversy at the time. This would have been around like 1995, when Blair went out of his way to court Murdoch, and to get Murdoch on side for the Labour Party. Murdoch had never supported the Labour Party prior to that, never, had a newspaper which was favourable towards the Labour Party. Blair consistently worked on that relationship until in 1997, the Sun actually came out and said, vote Labour. And people did vote Labour. Labour won by a landslide in 1997. And indeed, such was the work that Blair did in the 1990s that the Labour Party was still, by and large, supported by the Sun in 2001 as well, when it won another landslide. By 2005, things had soured a little bit, and the Sun wasn't so much on side at that point anymore, but it wasn't explicitly anti-Tony Blair. As soon as Tony Blair finishes, it goes back to hating Labour as well. But basically, in the 1980s, you see the emergence of a new kind of relationship between politics and press. Politicians recognise that they need the patronage of the press barons again. So we've almost, like, in a sense, gone all the way back to the 1910s and 1920s. Things just turn back around again, but it's a very different press to what existed in the 1910s and 1920s, and that's very, very important. These owners are much larger, much more media diverse in terms of their ownership of things. They don't just own newspapers, they own television stations, they own film studios, etc., etc. In the 90s, they start to own, companies involved with the internet, for example. So it's almost as if the relationship, these people are so powerful and so international that now, as opposed to in the political influence of the press barons in the 1910s and 1920s, was much more about newspapers pressuring politicians into inviting the press barons into this inner circle. Now, politicians have to chase after the press barons. They have to go for them explicitly. So, what kind of politics were there in the 1980s press? Aggressively right-wing politics, aggressively populist, playing on fears of crime, immigration, undeserving poor and scrounge, as I already said, very anti-trade union and very anti-Labour Party. Strong position on strikes. So this newspaper cover I've got here with, this is Arthur Scargill, the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers in 1984. In 1984 and 85, you have the miners' strike, which becomes a critical sort of incident in the social history of Britain in the 1980s. This front page didn't get printed. Now, as you can see, I mean, it's fairly disgusting. Mine Führer, basically they're making, because the Sun is arguing that Arthur Scargill is a Nazi, effectively. The print unions refused to print that edition. So there was some power left in the print unions, I guess, at this time, but it gives you an illustration of just how anti-organised labour, anti-trade union and anti-Labour Party, because the relationship between the Labour Party and the National Union of Mine Workers is very close. Interesting other part of this front page as well. I don't know if you can see on just next to the main story, you've got Sam Fox here. So basically, you've got like, what is our front page going to be today, editor? Well, we're going to have Arthur Scargill as a Nazi and a page 3 go. Sex and politics. That's how it works. Yeah. This is what actually went out on that day. So, as you can see, there was some power at least, but this is an illustration of how politically aligned the Sun was as a newspaper in the 1980s. This continues into the 1990s. So this was a newspaper on the morning of the 1992 general election. This is Neil Kinnock, the then leader of the Labour Party. If Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights? After that, I mean, it's a hugely important newspaper in the context of that election. Labour were favoured to win the 1992 election. It was going to be very close, but Labour led in all the polls up to the 1992 election, but then lost. And the Conservatives returned with a very small majority of little over 20, which eventually by 1997 would have disappeared as well. But the Sun basically, still aggressively anti-Labour into this time as well, and actually claimed after the day after that that the Sun won the election for the Conservative Party. This really position of the Sun and other tabloid newspapers was not reflected in the diversity of Britain. So if you look at the number of people who voted for the Conservative and the share of votes for the Conservatives, it's always around 40%. This was not reflected in the newspapers. In 1992, 70% of newspapers supported the Conservative Party, but only 40% of the people in the country supported the Conservative Party. So the electoral impact could be questioned, but no Prime Ministers, literally no Prime Minister has won an election since 79 without the support of the Sun. Other features of news in the 1980s and onwards: patriotic nationalism. So here we have a classic newspaper, classic Sun headline from the Falklands War in 1982. Our lads sink gunboat and whole cruiser. And there you go, union boycotts war underneath it as well. You've got to get some digs in at trade unions as well, you know. Anti-football fans, and very much anti the city of Liverpool. The most disgusting and most vile newspaper front page of all time, as far as I'm concerned, is this one on screen right now. The Truth, published a couple of days after the Hillsborough disaster in 1989. This newspaper front page, it undoubtedly transformed the discourse around the Hillsborough disaster, criminalised in the eyes of many people who died on that day, and led, you know, it took the best part of 25 years for campaigners to reverse the kind of damage that this front page did with regards to the reputation of people who were crushed to death that day, and the only thing that they did was went to go and watch a football match. The Hillsborough disaster, eventually, the blame for the tragic events of that day would correctly be ascribed to South Yorkshire Police and Sheffield Wednesday Football Club and their multiple negligent behaviours in terms of the quality of the stadium and the policing on that day. But this newspaper headline basically created a discourse that said that the people who were killed that day and the people who were crushed that day and the people who witnessed one of some of the worst scenes you can imagine were effectively criminals. Just to give some background to what this article came from, this article was leaked by a police officer to a Conservative MP called Irving Patnick, who was an MP for one of the Sheffield constituencies, who then leaked this information to the Sun. The editor at the Sun at the time was Calvin Mackenzie. Calvin Mackenzie frequently refused to apologise for these comments that he was made, that, you know, his newspaper, his front page, frequently refused to do so. Eventually would give a half-hearted and mealy-mouthed apology some 25 years later, but I think it's a bit late at that point. Basically, what does this tell us about the Sun in the 1980s? Anti-football fans, anti-City of Liverpool. Why would they hate Liverpool, Leighton? Well, Liverpool, very much a socialist city, a Labour sporting city. Very pro-law and order, no criticism of the police, no criticism of authority in that sense, and no willingness to actually investigate, and a total willingness to lie about the events of that day. You also get hand in hand with this kind of vile sort of coverage, you also get completely sort of irrelevant nonsense, you know, Freddie Starr ate my hamster. Really? I know you guys don't actually know who Freddie Starr is. He was one of these desperately unfunny comedians from the 1970s. But this is front page news. What? What? So, you get a change basically in journalism, right? Those are quite reflective of some of the changes. There are wider changes in the journalistic profession as well. So with rising production costs, easier and cheaper to use gossip, entertainment, celebrity news. Rather than serious journalism around politics, foreign coverage, and investigative and specialist journalism, these are all sort of constrained and constricted at this time in favour of lightweight news, what we would now call clickbait. And indeed, looking at newspapers in the contemporary setting, you know, this actual change in journalistic values has become pretty much endemic. At the same time, changes in production would emerge during the 1980s as well. So the Wapping dispute is very, very important in the context of this. Newspapers, even up to the 1980s, were still composed using hot metal, labour-intensive linotype methods, not an electronic method at all. Very labour-intensive. Very much meant that you had to have a large workforce to do this, when there was alternative technologies which had been available for some time now. Digital technologies and digital printing had been available for a long, long time, could be much cheaper, much more efficient. Basically, in the 1980s, the labour practices of the newspaper industry are going to meet with the IT revolution, and you're going to see a change in practice. So, in 1986, 6,000 News International is the company owned by Rupert Murdoch, workers went on strike because News International planned new working conditions, flexible working, no strike clause, end of close shop, and new IT methods in the production. So when these striking workers went on strike, News International sacked all the strikers and moved its production basically to a plant that they'd already built. This is kind of how devious and cunning that News International, owned by Rupert Murdoch, is. So they built a new printworks in secret with all this digital technology in it. Then they tried to impose a new contract on workers, knowing that the workers would go out and strike. And as soon as they went out and strike, they sacked all the workers and moved all their production to Wapping, to this new site. Kind of evil genius, brilliant, but it stinks as well, right? So, this became known as Fortress Wapping. Basically, you get a lot of production going on at this site, heavily fortified. Basically, a bit like a prison or something like that. High walls around it, barbed wire, armed guards around the place. Huge amount of mass demonstrations and picketing outside the plant as this industrial dispute was going on. But this became like a flashpoint for post-miners' strike conflict between unions and employers. Police were deployed in large numbers, many confrontations. Of course, News International had the support of the Conservative government. It had police backing, and basically production was not affected during this time at all. And of course, they had newspapers as well to demonise the strikers at the same time as well. So we get more, basically, what does this tell us? Well, the newspaper industry by 1986 had resolved the issues it had with organised labour and trade unions by sacking them all. And moving to new facilities and embracing digital technology. So that embracing of digital technologies then floods throughout the industry. You get a change in journalistic practices into a digital era. You also get a change in working conditions. And from being a safe, well-paid industry to work in, the newspaper industry undergoes radical change in the 1980s, to the extent now that journalists are effectively freelancers. And to have a staff job as a journalist in a newspaper is so rare in this day and age. Most journalists are actually just freelancers. By 1988, nearly all newspapers had left Fleet Street, for example, so everything is being consolidated in new places with new technology. And concurrently, you get massive job losses. You cut production costs by losing jobs. Thousands of jobs start to disappear from the industry. And that continues to this day. The industry now employs virtually nobody compared to its heyday. And that really can be traced back to the changes in the industry in the 1980s. The newspaper industry, my friends, is in effect in terminal decline. These are newspaper readership numbers over time. I mean, just incredible numbers here. If you look at the unbroken blue line, which sort of reaches a peak in 1965 over 5 million, that's the Daily Mirror. Daily Mirror goes from 5 million sales 50 years ago to just over 1 million in 2015, and it's a lot less than that now. The Sun, 4 million odd going into the 90s, is now down to 2 million. It's a hell of a lot less than that now. And it's just a huge, fall in numbers over time. In 2015, sort of as a daily circulation, you're still getting about 6 million newspapers sold in the UK. In 2020, you can halve that, and in fact, you can go under half that as well. So the newspaper industry, from being so critically important throughout the 20th century, for inventing a new business model, for inventing like the business model which social media has today of creating an audience to be sold to advertisers, from having massive political influence, both at the start of and later on in the century. As we sit in 2020, the newspaper industry is in absolute terminal decline, and in 5 years' time, if I'm doing this lecture then, well, two things. One, what have I done with my life? And two, I suspect that graph will be replaced with just a list of newspapers that have closed over the interim period. Okay, that's all I've got to say about newspapers from the 20th century. If you have any questions, hit me up on the comment section on this YouTube page, or email me, and I'll be back sometime later with the next lecture in the course, which will be the history of television. Cheers, guys.